My name is Rachel, and I am 33 years old. I sat in a ballroom surrounded by 200 of Atlanta's wealthiest elites, listening to my father deliver his retirement speech. He looked right at me, held up his champagne glass, and announced to the entire room that I was his uneducated, worthless daughter who freeloaded off the family. The entire room erupted into laughter. I did not flinch. I just smiled, lifted my own glass, and gave a toast that made the entire room drop dead silent. Within a week, I would legally seize every single asset he owned and throw him out on the street. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to completely destroy a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. The Crystal Ballroom at the Buckhead Country Club was suffocatingly lavish. Towering chandeliers cast a golden, arrogant glow over the crowd. 200 of the most influential corporate executives, investors, and socialites in Atlanta were gathered to celebrate the retirement of Richard, my father, and the CEO of Apex Freight. I sat at a table near the back, nursing a glass of sparkling water, wearing a tailored black power suit that cost more than most people make in a month. My family assumed I had bought it by draining the modest allowance they occasionally threw my way out of pity. They had absolutely no idea that I paid for it with money from my own multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition firm. Up on the stage, Richard adjusted the microphone. At 62 years old, he carried himself like a king surveying his kingdom. He was a man obsessed with country club prestige, fancy titles, and Ivy League degrees. He spent the first 20 minutes of his speech boasting about how he had built Apex Freight into a regional logistics empire. Then he shifted his focus to the family legacy. He gestured grandly toward the front table where my younger sister Vanessa sat beaming. She was 30 years old, dripping in expensive jewelry, and holding a useless Ivy League degree that Richard had fully funded. He praised her as his brilliant daughter, proudly announcing her title as Vice President of Marketing. It was a completely fabricated role where she did absolutely no actual work. Next to her sat her husband, Jamal. Jamal was a slick, charismatic African-American executive who served as the vice president of finance. Richard praised Jamal as a financial genius, the brilliant mind who would guide Apex Freight into the prosperous future. Then my father's eyes scanned the room and locked onto me. A cruel, familiar smirk twisted his lips. The microphone amplified his voice, ensuring that every single person in the ballroom hung on his next words. And of course we have Rachel. Richard announced, his tone dripping with theatrical pity. Every great family has its heavy burden. Rachel is my eldest, but unfortunately, she decided that higher education was too difficult. This is my daughter. No degree, no future, just an uneducated dropout who freeloads off the family name. I suppose someone has to be the cautionary tale. A ripple of laughter echoed through the massive ballroom. 200 wealthy strangers chuckled at my expense. I looked toward the front table. Vanessa was practically glowing with satisfaction, whispering something to Jamal, who let out a loud, arrogant laugh. Next to them sat my mother, Patricia. At 60 years old, Patricia cared about absolutely nothing except her social standing in the wealthy Atlanta suburbs. She did not look back at me. She did not defend her daughter. Instead, she took a slow, elegant sip of her gin martini, a serene smile resting on her perfectly manicured face. She was thoroughly enjoying the public humiliation. They expected me to shrink into my chair. For 13 years, ever since I dropped out of college at 20, to escape their suffocating conditional love, they had treated me like a pathetic charity case. They assumed I lived in a miserable studio apartment, barely scraping by. They thought my silence at family gatherings was born out of shame. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they never bothered to look past the surface. They did not know that I had spent the last decade teaching myself corporate finance, building a massive equity firm called Vanguard Holdings entirely in secret, and accumulating a net worth that made Richard's logistics company look like a roadside lemonade stand. I did not cry. I did not look away. I simply pushed my chair back. The harsh scrape of the wooden legs against the marble floor cut through the fading laughter. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my tailored suit. The ballroom grew quiet as 200 pairs of eyes shifted toward the back of the room, waiting to see if the disgraced daughter would run out in tears. I picked up my crystal water glass. I held my head high, my posture radiating an absolute chilling calm. I looked directly at my father standing on the brightly lit stage. I did not raise my voice, but the sudden suffocating silence in the room allowed my words to carry perfectly across the space. "Cheers, Richard," I said, my voice echoing with icy precision. "Enjoy this party. Celebrate while you still can, because this is the absolute last time any of you will ever see me." I lowered my glass and set it gently back onto the table. I did not wait for his response. I turned on my heel and began walking down the center aisle toward the grand double doors of the ballroom. The silence that fell over the room was absolute and deafening. It was not the silence of pity. It was the sudden terrifying silence of a room full of apex predators realizing that the prey they were mocking had just bared a set of lethal teeth. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Even the waitstaff carrying trays of expensive appetizers froze in place. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped out into the cool marble-lined lobby of the country club. My heart beat in a steady, powerful rhythm. I had just drawn the battle lines. They thought I was walking away in defeat, but I was actually walking straight toward the detonator that would blow their fraudulent, arrogant lives to pieces. I stepped out of the heavy mahogany doors of the Buckhead Country Club and into the thick, humid Atlanta night air. The sudden quiet of the exterior was a welcome relief from the suffocating arrogance of the ballroom. I walked smoothly down the sweeping stone steps toward the valet stand, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement. I handed my ticket to the attendant, taking a deep breath of the evening air. I felt completely detached, clinically cold, and absolutely ready for what was about to come. Before the valet could even turn to retrieve my vehicle, the country club doors crashed open behind me. The harsh light from the lobby spilled out onto the driveway, followed immediately by the sharp, frantic clicking of designer stilettos. "Rachel, wait right there." It was Vanessa. My younger sister came storming down the stone steps, her expensive silk gown swishing violently around her ankles. Her face was flushed red with indignation, completely shattering the polished, high society image she had been projecting all evening. Right on her heels was Jamal, looking slick and furious in his custom-tailored tuxedo. I turned around slowly, my expression completely impassive. I watched them march up to the valet stand like two spoiled children who had just been denied a toy. "What is wrong with you?" Vanessa shrieked, her voice echoing loudly across the quiet parking lot. A few valets glanced over, their eyes wide, but Vanessa did not care. "You are unbelievable, Rachel. You just had to make a scene, didn't you? You just had to ruin Dad's special night by being dramatic. You cannot stand the fact that we are successful and you are nothing." I looked at my sister, taking in the diamond tennis bracelet sparkling on her wrist and the furious, entitled glare in her eyes. She genuinely believed her own narrative. She thought my calm departure was a tantrum born of jealousy. "I am not being dramatic, Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I simply refuse to sit in a room and be insulted by a man who handed you a vice president title just for sharing his last name. Enjoy the party. I am done with this family." Jamal let out a harsh, condescending laugh. He stepped in front of Vanessa, puffing out his chest, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate me. As the vice president of finance at Apex Freight, Jamal walked around with an unearned superiority complex. He thought he was the smartest man in Atlanta simply because Richard had handed him the keys to the corporate treasury. "You are done with this family," Jamal sneered, shaking his head. "That is hilarious, Rachel. You have never been a part of this family's success. You dropped out of college. You bring absolutely nothing to the table. You are just a bitter, uneducated dropout who cannot handle being in the presence of actual corporate executives." I did not break eye contact. I let his arrogance wash over me, completely unaffected. Jamal reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a designer leather wallet. He snapped it open, his fingers pulling out a crisp $50 bill. He held it up between his index and middle finger, waving it in my face with a mocking, patronizing smirk. "Here," Jamal said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. He tossed the bill directly at my chest. It fluttered down and landed on the pristine concrete of the valet lane. Go pay for your Uber back to whatever miserable studio apartment you rent on the wrong side of town. Leave the corporate world to the educated adults, Rachel. You do not belong here. I looked down at the $50 bill resting on the ground. I did not bend down to pick it up. I did not shout back or defend my living situation. I simply took one step forward and planted my black stiletto heel directly onto the center of the money, grinding it slightly against the pavement. As I stood there looking at Jamal's smug face, the roar of a high-performance engine shattered the tension. A valet pulled up to the curb, driving a brand-new custom black Porsche. The vehicle gleamed under the country club lights. It was an absolute masterpiece of automotive engineering, complete with custom rims, a flawless leather interior, and a price tag that I knew instantly hovered around $150,000. The valet stepped out and held the door open. Jamal tossed the kid a casual tip. His chest puffed out even further as he turned to open the passenger door for Vanessa. My eyes locked onto the Porsche. I am not just a corporate owner. I am an apex predator in the financial acquisition space. I look at balance sheets all day. I audit massive multinational corporations for a living. My brain immediately began running the numbers, slicing through the illusion of Jamal's wealth with cold, mathematical precision. Apex Freight was a regional logistics firm, and a failing one at that. Based on the preliminary market data my team at Vanguard Holdings had pulled last week, Richard's company was bleeding cash. The profit margins were razor-thin, fuel costs were eating their revenue, and their supply chain contracts were outdated. The base salary for a vice president of finance at a struggling mid-tier logistics firm in Atlanta tops out at maybe $200,000 a year. I looked at Jamal's custom-tailored tuxedo. I looked at Vanessa's $30,000 diamond tennis bracelet. And I looked at the $150,000 Porsche idling at the curb. The math was completely wrong. It did not just fail to add up, it screamed of systemic catastrophic fraud. A mid-level finance executive at a sinking company cannot afford a lifestyle that mimics a Wall Street billionaire unless the money is coming from an illicit source. Jamal was not just mismanaging my father's company, he was draining it dry. He was embezzling corporate funds to bankroll his extravagant life with my sister, and Richard was far too arrogant and technologically incompetent to notice the cash hemorrhaging from his own accounts. You are looking at the car, Rachel, Jamal taunted, noticing my gaze. Keep dreaming. It takes a real degree in actual business sense to earn something like this. You will never even sit in one. I looked away from the Porsche and met Jamal's eyes. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a hunter who has just spotted the fatal weakness in their prey. You are absolutely right, Jamal, I said, my voice eerily calm, carrying a weight that made his smug expression falter for just a fraction of a second. I will never sit in a car like that, but I highly recommend you enjoy the leather seats while you still can. Financial illusions have a very nasty habit of catching up to reality. Before Jamal could respond, a massive black armored SUV pulled smoothly into the valet lane, stopping directly behind the Porsche. The vehicle was completely blacked out, exuding an aura of absolute intimidating power. My private chauffeur, wearing a crisp dark suit, stepped out immediately and opened the rear passenger door for me. Vanessa and Jamal stared at the armored SUV, genuine confusion washing over their faces. This did not fit their narrative of the poor, struggling dropout. I stepped off the $50 bill, leaving it crushed against the concrete. I slid into the luxurious, soundproof interior of the SUV. I did not look back as my chauffeur closed the heavy door, shutting out my family and their fraudulent, arrogant existence. The trap was already set, and they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. The heavy door of the armored SUV closed with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly cutting off the ambient noise of the country club parking lot. I sank back into the plush leather seating as the vehicle smoothly accelerated away from the curb. Through the heavily tinted bulletproof glass, I watched Jamal and Vanessa staring after me, their expressions a comical mix of confusion and lingering arrogance. They were probably convincing themselves that I had hired the car just to put on a fake show. I pressed a silver button on the center console. The soundproof privacy partition glided up silently, completely separating me from the driver's cabin. The interior of the vehicle was pitch black, illuminated only by the soft, icy blue ambient lighting of the digital displays. This was my real world. It was not the flashy, desperate display of wealth my father craved, but the quiet, untouchable power of actual corporate dominance. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my encrypted work phone. This device did not officially exist on any public telecommunications registry. It was a secure line used solely to communicate with the highest-ranking executives within my empire. I bypassed the biometric security screen and tapped a single speed dial contact. The line rang exactly once before being picked up. On the other end was David, the chief legal officer of Vanguard Holdings. David was a 55-year-old legal shark who had spent 3 decades dismantling corrupt corporations and shredding arrogant executives in federal court. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of corporate litigation and was absolutely loyal to me. He did not care that I lacked an Ivy League degree. He only cared that I had a mind like a steel trap and a flawless track record of orchestrating highly profitable corporate acquisitions. "Good evening, Rachel." David's deep, gravelly voice echoed through the secure speakerphone. "I assume the retirement party was just as insufferable as we predicted." "It was entirely predictable, David," I replied, my voice stripped of the polite restraint I had used outside. Richard gave a lovely speech to 200 people about my lack of education. Jamal threw a $50 bill at my feet and told me to leave the corporate world to the adults. And Vanessa is still pretending she knows how to read a basic balance sheet. But none of that matters right now. I need an immediate tactical status update on the Apex Freight acquisition. Where exactly are we standing? I heard the rustle of heavy cardstock as David opened a physical dossier on his desk. "We have them completely cornered, Rachel. The preliminary financial audits we ran through our shell corporations paint a very grim picture for your father. Apex Freight is effectively drowning in secret, highly leveraged debt. Their operational costs have skyrocketed due to terrible management. Their regional logistics contracts are bleeding cash daily, and their primary commercial credit lines are completely maxed out. Richard is desperately looking for a financial lifeline. He has absolutely no idea that Vanguard Holdings is the massive entity reaching out to buy him, and he certainly has no idea that you are the founder and sole owner of Vanguard." "And what about Jamal?" I asked, recalling the gleam of the $150,000 Porsche idling in the valet lane. "Is he managing the acquisition negotiations on their end?" "Jamal is leading the charge," David confirmed with a dark, knowing chuckle. "He is acting like a Wall Street hotshot, practically begging our proxy representatives to finalize the buyout. He is currently pitching Apex Freight at a $20 million valuation. It is a completely fabricated number based on manipulated revenue projections and fraudulent inventory reports, but Richard seems to believe every single word Jamal tells him. They are pushing for a rapid close by next Monday. They want the massive cash payout before their commercial creditors realize the company is functionally insolvent." I stared at the glowing blue lights of the SUV console, my mind racing through the tactical variables. Jamal thought he was successfully tricking an anonymous corporate monolith. He thought he was going to walk away with millions in clean cash while handing us a sinking ship. He had absolutely no idea he was negotiating with the woman he had just ordered to take an Uber home. "Execute the trap," I commanded, my voice dropping to a lethal, uncompromising register. "Instruct our proxy negotiators to verbally agree to the $20 million valuation, draft the preliminary term sheets, and send them over tomorrow morning. I want Richard and Jamal to believe they have won the corporate lottery. Let them think they are retiring incredibly rich and walking away completely clean. They are going to celebrate," David noted, the predatory anticipation evident in his tone. "They will likely pop expensive champagne the second the term sheet hits their inbox." "But what about the final binding signatures and the due diligence clauses?" "That is exactly where we lock the doors," I instructed. "I want you to structure the acquisition agreement to include absolute personal liability for all current executive officers regarding undisclosed debts or financial malfeasance. Bury it deep in the legal jargon that Jamal is far too arrogant and uneducated to actually read. Lock the escape routes, David. Ensure that once they sign the preliminary transition documents, they are legally binding themselves to the structural integrity of those fake financial reports. When I walk into their boardroom on Monday morning, I do not just want to buy their logistics company. I want them to realize they are trapped in a financial cage of their own making. I will have the corporate litigation team work through the night to weaponize the contracts, David assured me. The entire trap will be fully armed and waiting for your final execution order. Have a good evening, Rachel. I disconnected the secure line and placed the encrypted phone on the seat next to me. I looked out the window as the armored SUV glided smoothly onto the bustling Atlanta highway. The vibrant city lights blurred into long streaks of gold and red against the dark glass. My father wanted to make me the pathetic punchline of his grand retirement celebration. Instead, he had just handed me the pen to rewrite his entire legacy. The uneducated dropout was about to become his absolute worst nightmare. The morning sun breached the horizon, casting a brilliant golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. I stood quietly in the center of my massive kitchen, holding a sleek ceramic mug of black coffee, watching the city of Atlanta wake up far below me. My residence occupied the entire top floor of one of the most exclusive residential high-rises in Buckhead. It was a sprawling sanctuary of imported Italian marble, custom mahogany fixtures, and absolute untouchable silence. There were no roommates here. There was no struggle to make rent. This was the quiet, fortified reality of a woman who had built a corporate empire from the ground up, standing in stark contrast to the chaotic, fraudulent circus my family was currently orchestrating. My personal cell phone buzzed violently against the polished granite island, vibrating with the urgency of a manufactured crisis. I set my coffee mug down and picked up the device. The screen lit up with a massive block of text. It was a message from Patricia. I unlocked the screen and read my mother's words. "You completely embarrassed your father last night. Walking out like that was a pathetic, childish display of jealousy because you cannot handle Vanessa's success. Your father has worked his entire life to build Apex Freight, and Jamal has brilliantly managed the finances to get us to the finish line. Do not expect a single dime from the company sale next week. Jamal secured an anonymous buyer for $20 million, and they are signing the papers on Monday. You are officially cut off from this family and our money. Do not call us." I read the message twice, letting the sheer, unfiltered delusion wash over me. A genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth, driven purely by the staggering irony of her threat. Patricia was 60 years old, a woman whose entire identity was wrapped up in country club gossip, expensive tennis skirts, and maintaining a flawless facade of generational wealth. She had never balanced a checkbook in her life. She blindly trusted my father, who in turn blindly trusted Jamal. She was threatening to cut me off from a bank account that was functionally empty. She was weaponizing a $20 million buyout that was currently being orchestrated by my own legal team. Jamal had sold them an absolute fantasy, convincing them that Apex Freight was a highly coveted acquisition target. The reality was that Apex Freight was a sinking ship bleeding cash from every single operational artery, and the only reason Vanguard Holdings was stepping in was because I wanted to personally oversee the demolition. Patricia genuinely believed she was holding all the cards. She thought the $20 million was real cash that would soon hit their personal accounts, allowing her to buy new vacation homes and fund Vanessa's lavish shopping sprees forever. She did not realize that the buyer Jamal had secured was the exact same uneducated dropout she had just banished from her life. I tapped the reply box on the screen. I did not write a lengthy paragraph defending myself. I did not point out the fact that Jamal was driving a car he could not possibly afford on a legitimate salary. I did not try to save her from the financial tsunami that was rapidly approaching their shores. You cannot save people who are actively fighting to stay on a sinking ship. I simply typed a single, devastatingly concise sentence. "Enjoy the illusion, Mom. Math doesn't lie." I hit send. I pictured Patricia sitting in the breakfast nook of their heavily mortgaged suburban mansion holding her phone with perfectly manicured hands, her face twisting in confusion and rage at my complete lack of subservience. Less than 10 seconds later, my phone began to ring. The screen flashed with an incoming call from Patricia. She wanted a screaming match. She wanted to berate me to assert her dominance and to force me to apologize for disrespecting the family hierarchy. I stared at her contact name glowing on the screen. For 33 years, that name had represented a source of constant anxiety, a relentless demand for conformity, and a continuous stream of subtle emotional abuse. Today, it represented absolutely nothing. I tapped the red icon declining the call. I opened her contact settings, scrolled to the very bottom of the menu, and pressed Block Caller. I felt a profound, heavy weight lift from my shoulders. The boundary was officially set, and it was forged in titanium. They could not threaten me, they could not insult me, and they could not access me. They were sealed inside the pressure cooker of their own fraudulent existence, and I was holding the only release valve. I placed my phone into my leather briefcase and grabbed my keys. I walked out of my penthouse and stepped into my private elevator, pressing the button for the subterranean executive garage. It was time to shift from the discarded daughter into the chief executive officer. My armored black SUV was waiting for me, the engine already idling quietly. My chauffeur opened the door and I slid into the back seat. I directed him to Vanguard headquarters in the heart of the financial district. The drive was swift. When we pulled up to the towering glass and steel monolith that housed my corporate empire, the valets and security personnel immediately snapped to attention. I walked through the grand lobby, my heels clicking sharply against the polished terrazzo floors. The environment here was entirely different from the Buckhead Country Club. There were no country club socialites discussing petty gossip. There were only sharp, highly educated financial analysts, ruthless corporate lawyers, and aggressive acquisition specialists. And every single one of them reported directly to me. I stepped into the executive elevator and rode it to the top floor. The doors slid open to reveal the war room, a massive glass-walled conference space equipped with state-of-the-art digital projection screens and secure data terminals. David was already standing at the head of the long mahogany table, surrounded by my top forensic accountants. The table was covered in thick financial dossiers, bank statements, and operational ledgers belonging to Apex Freight. "Good morning, Rachel," David said, a sharp, predatory glint in his eye. "We have the internal books from Apex Freight." We bypassed Jamal's heavily manipulated executive summaries and pulled the raw banking data directly through our clearance protocols. I set my briefcase down and took off my suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of my pristine white blouse. The time for passive observation was over. The trap had been set at the country club, the term sheets were being drafted, and the family was currently celebrating their fake $20 million lottery ticket. Now I needed to locate the exact mechanism of their impending destruction. "Put the operational ledgers on the main screen," I commanded, stepping up to the head of the table. "Let us dig into the prey. I want to see exactly how Jamal is hiding his stolen money. Let us dig into the prey. I want to see exactly how Jamal is hiding his stolen money." The massive digital screen at the front of the war room flickered to life, illuminating the dark mahogany walls with endless rows of dense financial data. My lead forensic accountant, a brilliant data analyst named Marcus, had been rigorously analyzing the book since dawn, but I did not need him to walk me through the basics. I stepped right up to the screen, my eyes rapidly scanning the profit and loss statements. To an untrained observer, the spreadsheets looked like a chaotic wall of numbers. To me, they told a very clear, very pathetic story. Richard was an old-school logistics man. He liked walking the loading docks, shaking hands, and bragging at the country club. He fundamentally lacked the intellectual capacity to understand modern corporate finance. When his company began bleeding cash 3 years ago, due to his outdated business model, he panicked. Instead of restructuring, he handed the keys to the corporate treasury directly to his new son-in-law. Richard trusted Jamal blindly because Jamal wore expensive tailored suits, held a polished degree, and used aggressive Wall Street buzzwords. that Richard did not actually understand but loved to repeat. Richard believed he had hired a financial savior. In reality, he had invited a parasite directly into the host organism. I looked at the primary asset column. Jamal had pitched a $20 million valuation to my proxy buyers. It took me exactly 30 seconds to dismantle that illusion. Look at this top-line revenue projection, I said, pointing a digital laser pen at the upper quadrant of the screen. Jamal is logging uncollected, highly contested accounts receivable as cash on hand. He is booking projected revenue for contracts that have not even been signed yet. This is not just aggressive accounting. This is a deliberate, desperate inflation of earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. He is artificially pumping up the company's value to trick a buyer into a massive cash payout before the entire commercial credit structure collapses. David leaned against the heavy mahogany table, adjusting his glasses. So the $20 million valuation is a complete sham. The company is functionally insolvent. It is worse than insolvent, I replied, keeping my eyes locked on the data. Mismanagement explains a failing business, but mismanagement does not pay for a $150,000 custom Porsche. Filter the accounts payable for the last 36 months. I want you to isolate all third-party subcontractor disbursements exceeding $50,000. The forensic accountant's fingers flew across his keyboard. The master spreadsheet shifted, filtering out the noise and replacing it with a clean, heavily concentrated list of vendor payments. My eyes darted down the list, hunting for the structural anomalies I knew had to be there. I found them almost instantly. Pull the operational manifests for these 4 companies, I commanded, circling a block of text on the screen. Southern Transit Partners, Horizon Freight Lines, Atlantic Cargo Logistics, and Peach State Hauling. The room went quiet for a moment as the system queried the Apex Freight operational database. The accountant looked up, a grim expression settling on his face. There are no operational manifests, Rachel, the accountant reported. There are no weigh station receipts. There are no State Department of Transportation compliance logs, no fuel consumption records, and absolutely no driver payroll histories attached to these vendors. Because they do not exist, I stated coldly. They are ghost vendors. I walked slowly around the conference table, the absolute depth of the betrayal crystallizing in my mind. Jamal was running a textbook corporate embezzlement scheme, and he was executing it with staggering arrogance. He was creating fake trucking contracts in the Apex Freight accounting system. He would generate fraudulent invoices for hauling routes that were never actually driven. Apex Freight, bleeding cash from its legitimate operations, would blindly pay these fake invoices right out of its primary commercial accounts. David pulled out a secure tablet, rapidly cross-referencing the state corporate registry. I have the incorporation documents for these 4 LLCs, David said, his voice dropping an octave. They are registered to a series of anonymous post office boxes in Delaware, but the registered agent who filed the original paperwork is a boutique defense attorney here in Atlanta. The exact same attorney who handled the real estate closing for Jamal and Vanessa's suburban mansion. Trace the routing numbers, I ordered. David executed the search. The room watched the digital trail unfold on the main screen in real time. The millions of dollars bleeding out of Apex Freight funneled directly through the ghost vendors, bounced through a secondary holding account, and finally landed in a private high-yield offshore wealth management account. The sole signatory on that offshore account was Jamal. There is the smoking gun, I said, staring at the final destination of the stolen funds. There is the custom Porsche. There is Vanessa's $30,000 diamond tennis bracelet. There is the luxury trip to the Maldives she loves to brag about on social media. Jamal is not just a terrible vice president of finance. He is a predator. He has been systematically siphoning off the lifeblood of my father's company to bankroll his extravagant, fraudulent lifestyle. How much has he taken? David asked. The forensic accountant ran the final calculation. Based on the fraudulent invoice history over the last 36 months, Jamal has successfully embezzled roughly $4.2 million. I let the number hang in the air. $4.2 million. While my father was standing on a stage mocking my lack of a college degree, his educated genius son-in-law was robbing him absolutely blind. Jamal had manufactured a massive hidden debt crisis that Richard was entirely oblivious to. Apex Freight was a hollow shell rotting from the inside out, held together entirely by Jamal's fake spreadsheets and my father's colossal ego. If we factor in the stolen operating capital and the massive commercial debts Richard incurred to keep the lights on, the true valuation of Apex Freight is zero. David noted, closing his dossier. The company is dead water. We should immediately cancel the acquisition. If Jamal realizes we know about the ghost vendors, he will destroy the remaining servers and flee the country. No, I countered instantly, my voice ringing with absolute unyielding authority. If we cancel the buyout, Jamal covers his tracks, and Richard simply declares standard bankruptcy. They get to walk away and play the victims of a bad economy. That is not how Vanguard Holdings operates. We are not canceling anything. David looked at me, a slow, predatory smile forming on his face as he realized my strategy. You want to execute the contracts. I want them to feel safe, I said, turning away from the screen and looking directly at my chief legal officer. Tell our proxy negotiators to enthusiastically accept the $20 million valuation. Send them the preliminary term sheets this afternoon. Let Jamal think he has successfully conned a multi-million-dollar firm. Let Richard plan his lavish retirement. Let them sign the binding transition documents complete with the absolute personal liability clauses you drafted last night. I picked up my coffee cup, taking a slow sip. The trap was no longer just a financial acquisition. It was a fully armed criminal referral. Jamal thought he was the smartest man in the room, and Vanessa thought her luxury lifestyle was a permanent right. I was going to let them climb all the way to the absolute peak of their arrogance before I severed the safety line. I was going to let them climb all the way to the absolute peak of their arrogance before I severed the safety line. Later that evening, I returned to my penthouse in Buckhead. The city below was a glowing grid of amber streetlights and endless traffic. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of mineral water in my hand, watching the world move beneath me. My corporate litigation team at Vanguard Holdings was currently working through the night drafting the heavily weaponized term sheets that would seal my family into their own financial tomb. Everything was proceeding with clinical absolute perfection. Then my personal cell phone buzzed on the kitchen island. I walked over and glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number completely devoid of caller identification. Given that I had permanently blocked Patricia, Richard, and Vanessa earlier that morning, my immediate assumption was a burner phone or a masked voice over internet protocol application. Arrogant people simply cannot tolerate being ignored. They view silence not as a boundary, but as a challenge to their dominance. I tapped the green accept button and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not say a word, I simply waited. Did you really think blocking my number would stop me from having the last word? Vanessa demanded, her shrill nasal voice echoing through the receiver. My younger sister sounded incredibly pleased with herself, practically vibrating with toxic entitlement. I could hear the faint clinking of crystal glass in the background. She was likely sitting in her heavily mortgaged suburban living room, drinking expensive wine bought with stolen money, desperate to secure one final victory over the uneducated dropout of the family. I pressed a button on the side of my phone, silently routing the call audio into the encrypted secure server housed at Vanguard headquarters. Georgia is a one-party consent state for recording conversations. I did not need her permission to document her arrogance. I just needed her to keep talking. I did not block you to silence you, Vanessa, I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I blocked you because you are no longer relevant to my life. That is hilarious. Vanessa scoffed, her tone dripping with absolute condescension. You are just embarrassed. You are humiliated because Dad told the entire country club the absolute truth about you. You bring nothing to this family. But I called to give you some good news, Rachel. We are officially selling Apex Freight for $20 million next week. Jamal single-handedly orchestrated the entire buyout. He saved the family legacy while you were busy throwing a tantrum in the parking lot. I walked back to the window, looking out over the city skyline, entirely unbothered by her pathetic attempt to make me jealous. $20 million is a very impressive number, I said, carefully modulating my tone to sound slightly impressed, feeding the bottomless pit of her ego. It is more money than you will ever see in your lifetime, Vanessa bragged, completely swallowing the bait. Jamal and I are flying to the Maldives next month to celebrate. First-class overwater bungalow, the absolute best of everything. We are going to relax on the beach while you figure out how to pay your miserable utility bills. This is what a real degree gets you, Rachel. It gets you respect, it gets you a vice president title, and it gets you an elite lifestyle. Her complete ignorance of actual corporate finance was staggering. She held a degree she had never used functioning as a vice president of marketing, who had never actually marketed a single product. She thought wealth was generated by simply existing. I decided it was time to test exactly how deep her ignorance ran. I needed to know if Jamal was acting alone or if my sister was a willing, knowing accomplice to his federal crimes. If Jamal is such a financial genius, I asked, keeping my voice light and inquisitive, how did he handle the corporate tax liabilities for a $20 million buyout, especially with the massive operational debt on the books? From what I understand about logistics, subcontractor costs usually eat up the profit margins. Companies like Southern Transit Partners and Horizon Freight Lines. There was a brief pause on the line. I heard Vanessa take a sip of her wine. When she spoke again, she sounded incredibly smug, eager to play the role of the educated corporate executive, schooling her dropout sister. You really do not understand high-level business at all, do you? Vanessa laughed a sharp, grating sound. Those are not real subcontractors, Rachel. Jamal set those entities up himself. It is a brilliant corporate tax loophole. He funnels the profits through those holding companies to bypass the corporate tax rate before the buyout. It shields our liquid cash from the IRS. I froze. The sheer breathtaking stupidity of her statement echoed in my silent penthouse. She had just confessed to wire fraud, tax evasion, and corporate embezzlement on a recorded line, and she genuinely thought she was explaining a clever business strategy. She thought money laundering was just a smart tax loophole they taught at Ivy League universities. So Jamal personally controls the bank accounts for Southern Transit Partners and Horizon Freight Lines, I asked, ensuring the parameters of her confession were absolutely clear for the federal prosecutors who would eventually hear this audio file. And Dad approved this strategy. Dad does not even know how to check his own email, Vanessa scoffed dismissively. He leaves the complex financial architecture to Jamal. Jamal controls the offshore accounts where the money sits. It is entirely legal, Rachel. They teach this in advanced business school, but obviously you wouldn't know anything about that. You should really try reading a book sometime. It might help you get a real job. The noose was officially tied, looped, and secured. Vanessa had just handed me the final irrefutable proof I needed. Jamal was running the embezzlement scheme entirely under the radar. Richard was completely negligent in his fiduciary duties as chief executive officer, and Vanessa was an active, willing beneficiary of stolen funds. They were a syndicate of fools. You are absolutely right, Vanessa, I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register that carried the absolute weight of a financial executioner. I do not understand your version of high-level business, but I am sure the federal government will find your tax loopholes completely fascinating. What is that supposed to mean? Vanessa demanded, her smug tone faltering for a fraction of a second, a tiny sliver of doubt finally piercing her delusion. It means you should pack lightly for the Maldives, I replied. Enjoy your wine, Vanessa. I ended the call. I did not wait for her to scream or demand an explanation. I immediately exported the encrypted audio file from the Vanguard server and emailed it directly to David with a single line of text attached. Add this to the prosecution dossier. The trap is fully armed. I placed my phone face down on the marble kitchen island. The golden child had just sealed her husband's fate and guaranteed her own absolute ruin, all because she could not resist the urge to brag to the sister she despised. The illusion of their wealth was about to shatter, and I was going to be the one holding the hammer. Monday morning arrived with a cold, overcast sky that perfectly matched the bleak reality of my father's failing empire. I stepped out of my armored SUV and looked up at the Apex Freight headquarters. It was a tired 6-story concrete building situated in a decaying industrial park on the outskirts of Atlanta. The massive corporate logo on the side of the building was fading, and the visitor parking lot was riddled with neglected potholes. This was the kingdom Richard bragged about at the Buckhead Country Club. To the untrained eye, it looked like a modest, functional logistics hub. To a corporate acquisition specialist, it looked like a financial graveyard waiting for the final dirt to be shoveled over it. I walked through the sliding glass front doors flanked by David, my chief legal officer, and four heavily built, impeccably dressed corporate security personnel. The ground floor lobby was a miserable space that smelled faintly of cheap industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Blue-collar workers and dispatchers moved through the area with exhausted, defeated expressions. They were the ones actually keeping this sinking ship afloat, completely unaware that their chief executive officer and vice president of finance had been systematically robbing them of operational resources for years. Vanguard Holdings was not just acquiring a company today. We were effectively rescuing hundreds of working-class jobs from the sheer staggering incompetence of my own family. We bypassed the receptionist, who was too intimidated by my security detail to say a single word, and stepped directly into the executive elevator. I pressed the button for the 6th floor. David stood beside me, clutching a massive 500-page, leather-bound acquisition dossier against his chest. Inside that binder were the fully executed, digitally signed transition documents Jamal had eagerly authorized on Friday afternoon. Those documents contained the absolute personal liability clauses that legally bound Richard and Jamal to the fraudulent financial numbers they had provided. The elevator chimed and the doors slid open to reveal a completely different world. The executive floor was an oasis of manufactured fraudulent wealth. The cheap industrial carpet of the lower floors was replaced by plush imported wool. The walls were lined with expensive dark oak paneling and abstract art that Richard had purchased using the company's failing credit lines. The rich aromatic scent of premium artisanal espresso wafted down the quiet hallway, a stark contrast to the burnt breakroom coffee downstairs. I led my team silently down the corridor until we reached the massive solid oak double doors of the primary executive boardroom. I held up my hand, signaling David and the security team to stop. The heavy doors were closed, but they were not completely soundproof. The arrogant, booming voices of my family echoed clearly into the hallway. I wanted to hear exactly how high they had built their pedestal before I kicked it completely out from under them. "I cannot believe how incredibly easy that was," Jamal was saying, his deep, slick voice practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. "I thought Vanguard Holdings was supposed to be some ruthless Wall Street monolith. But their proxy negotiators barely even pushed back on the revenue projections I submitted. They swallowed the $20 million valuation without a single fight." Jamal let out a loud, triumphant laugh. I pictured him leaning back in one of the plush leather executive chairs wearing a custom-tailored suit, paid for by his ghost vendors, sipping espresso and congratulating himself for pulling off the corporate heist of the decade. "Because you are a genius," Jamal, Richard replied, his tone heavy with absolute paternal pride. "I always knew bringing you into the family business was the right move. You navigated this buyout perfectly. We are walking away clean. The commercial debts will be Vanguard's problem, and we are going to enjoy a very comfortable retirement. You saved this family's son." There was a brief pause accompanied by the distinct clinking of fine porcelain coffee cups. Then Vanessa chimed in. "It is just so satisfying." Vanessa sighed happily, her voice dripping with toxic entitlement. "After all the stress we have dealt with, we finally get our massive payout. I was looking at the overwater bungalows in the Maldives this morning. I think we should upgrade to the private reserve suite. We can absolutely afford it now." "You can book whatever you want," baby Jamal told his wife affectionately. "The wire transfer for the initial $10 million buyout phase should hit our primary accounts by noon today, right after these Vanguard executives finally show up and shake our hands." The sheer, breathtaking delusion was almost difficult to listen to. They genuinely believed a multi-million-dollar equity firm was simply going to wire $10 million into their accounts without a rigorous in-person forensic audit. Jamal had confused the swiftness of our preliminary term sheets with corporate negligence. He thought he had outsmarted the system completely, unaware that the system was currently standing right outside the door recording his every word. "I am just glad a certain someone is not here to ruin the mood," Richard suddenly remarked, bringing the conversation to the exact topic I was waiting for. Did you see Rachel's pathetic little exit at the country club? She tried to act so tough, walking out like she actually had somewhere important to be. Vanessa let out a sharp, grating laugh. I actually called her on Friday night, Vanessa bragged to the room. I felt a little bit of pity, so I told her about the $20 million buyout. She tried to ask me all these technical questions about subcontractor tax loopholes, like she actually knew what she was talking about. It was embarrassing. I had to explain basic corporate finance to her. She is probably sitting in her miserable little apartment right now, eating instant noodles and crying about how she missed out on the family fortune. She made her choice, Richard stated coldly. She decided education and hard work were beneath her. Let her rot in the bed she made. Rachel will spend the rest of her life fetching coffee for successful people like us. We are the elite Jamal. Today we make it official. I looked down at the silver Rolex Daytona on my left wrist. The second hand swept flawlessly past the 12. It was exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the precise time scheduled for the Vanguard Holdings acquisition closing meeting. I looked over at David. The 55-year-old legal shark simply smiled, adjusting his tie, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of the slaughter. I nodded. I stepped forward, reaching out with both hands, and firmly grasped the heavy brass handles of the boardroom doors. The metal was cold against my palms. Inside the room, the joyful, arrogant chatter continued, completely oblivious to the impending structural collapse of their entire universe. I turned the handles, the heavy brass clicking loudly in the quiet hallway, and pushed the doors wide open. The massive oak doors swung inward, gliding smoothly on their heavy brass hinges, before coming to a firm, commanding stop against the paneled walls. The Vanguard Holdings legal team stepped into the room first. David led the formation, his tailored charcoal suit and silver hair, giving him the appearance of a seasoned general stepping onto a conquered battlefield. Right behind him walked three of my elite corporate litigators carrying heavy leather briefcases. They moved with aggressive, synchronized precision, immediately fanning out to take physical control of the space. My four corporate security personnel filed in silently behind them, taking up positions by the entrance and completely blocking the only exit. Then I crossed the threshold. I did not skulk into the room like the disgraced, uneducated dropout they had mocked at the country club. I walked in with the absolute unyielding posture of a chief executive officer. The ambient light of the boardroom caught the sharp, impeccable lines of my $5,000 tailored navy power suit. The Italian wool draped flawlessly over my frame, paired with a crisp white silk blouse and pristine black stiletto heels. I looked like money. I looked like ruthless, untouchable corporate dominance. I walked past the empty leather chairs and stopped at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, directly facing my family. The transition in the room was instantaneous and incredibly satisfying. The joyful, arrogant chatter died in their throats. The clinking of the fine porcelain coffee cups ceased entirely. Richard was sitting at the head of the table, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. Jamal was leaning back in his chair, his custom suit jacket unbuttoned, his legs crossed in a posture of supreme arrogance. Vanessa was perched next to him, scrolling through luxury resort photos on her phone. As their eyes registered my presence, the shock on their faces rapidly morphed into deep, visceral annoyance. They looked at the team of men in suits surrounding me, completely failing to process the reality of the situation. Their brains simply could not connect the imposing legal team with the daughter they despised. Richard slammed his coffee cup down onto its saucer, spilling dark espresso onto the polished wood. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He projected his chest forward, trying to summon the fading authority of his CEO title. "Rachel, what is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing sharply in the quiet room. He barked a harsh, condescending laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Who let you pass security? Are you fetching coffee for the buyers? Because this is a restricted executive floor. You cannot just sneak in here to throw another tantrum." Vanessa dropped her phone onto the table, glaring at me with absolute venom. "You are unbelievable," she hissed, her voice rising in pitch. "I told you on the phone last night that we are closing a $20 million deal today. Are you really so desperate for attention that you hired actors to barge in here and ruin our meeting? Get out before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. I did not say a single word. I simply stood there, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the mahogany table, my expression carved from absolute ice. I let them dig their graves deeper. I wanted to hear every single insult they had left in their arsenal before I vaporized their entire existence. Jamal stood up next, buttoning his suit jacket. He tried to project the alpha male dominance he believed his vice president title afforded him. He pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "Listen to me very carefully, Rachel." Jamal sneered, his tone dripping with toxic superiority. "Vanguard Holdings executives are walking through those doors any minute now. We are executing a massive, highly sensitive financial acquisition. This is the real corporate world, not whatever fantasy you live in. You are trespassing on a secure commercial property. Take your little entourage and leave right now, or I will personally have security drag you out through the lobby." The sheer staggering blindness of their arrogance was a marvel to witness. They were looking directly at the firing squad and complaining about the noise. I gave David a subtle, barely perceptible nod. David stepped forward. He did not rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator closing its jaws. He walked right up to the center of the massive mahogany table, stopping just a few feet away from where Richard and Jamal were standing. He lifted the heavy 500-page leather-bound acquisition dossier he had been carrying against his chest. He held it suspended in the air for a fraction of a second, ensuring all their eyes were locked onto it. Then David brought it down. He slammed the massive binder onto the solid wood table with terrifying force. The loud, violent thud echoed through the boardroom like a gunshot. Dust motes danced in the air beneath the heavy chandeliers. Richard physically jumped, his eyes darting from the binder to David's hardened, uncompromising face. David rested his large hands flat on top of the dossier. He looked Richard dead in the eye, his voice rumbling with cold, absolute legal authority. Richard David said, his articulation flawless and cutting. "There are no other executives coming through those doors today. The proxy negotiators you have been dealing with report directly to me, and I report directly to the woman standing at the end of this table." David gestured smoothly toward me with an open hand. "Allow me to introduce the founder and sole owner of Vanguard Holdings," David announced, letting the words hang in the air like a guillotine blade. "Your new boss, Rachel." The oxygen vanished from the room. The color completely drained from Richard's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw slackened, and his knees seemed to buckle slightly against the edge of the table. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror that completely erased his lifelong arrogance. Jamal froze entirely, his outstretched, pointing finger dropping slowly to his side as his brain short-circuited desperately, trying to process the mathematical impossibility of the statement. Vanessa let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her mouth in pure, unadulterated shock. I stood at the end of the table watching the devastating reality crash over them. The uneducated dropout they had humiliated, discarded, and mocked had not just entered their corporate sanctuary, I had just bought it out from under them. And I was about to burn it to the ground. The silence that filled the executive boardroom was absolute and suffocating. It was a heavy physical weight that pressed down on the room, so profound that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents and the shallow, panicked breathing of my sister. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The reality of David's introduction was simply too massive for their arrogant minds to process. Richard blinked rapidly, his eyes darting between David, the security personnel, and finally settling back on me. His brain, deeply conditioned by decades of patriarchal superiority and country club delusion, completely rejected the information. He shook his head, a strained, desperate smirk stretching across his face. "That is a very funny joke," Richard said, his voice cracking slightly. He let out a harsh, unnatural laugh that echoed awkwardly off the oak-paneled walls. "It is a sick, twisted joke. You hired these people to come in here and play a prank because you are bitter. Jamal, call security. Get these actors out of my boardroom right now." Jamal did not move. He did not reach for his phone. He was a finance executive, and his eyes were glued to the silver-embossed Vanguard Holdings logo on the leather dossier David had just slammed onto the table. He recognized the official corporate seal. He knew it was not a prop. I did not smile. I did not offer a witty comeback. I simply walked forward, my stilettos clicking with absolute measured authority against the imported wool carpet. I moved down the length of the massive mahogany table, flanked by the cold, unyielding presence of my legal team. Vanessa shrank back in her leather chair as I passed her, pulling her arms tightly around her chest, as if I were going to physically strike her. I ignored her entirely. I reached the head of the table. Richard was standing directly in front of the oversized, high-backed leather CEO chair, gripping the armrests with white knuckles. He looked at me, expecting me to back down, expecting the obedient, discarded daughter to yield to his authority. "Move," I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it resonated with a lethal, absolute command that left zero room for negotiation. Richard opened his mouth to argue, his face flushing with a renewed surge of indignity. "This is my chair," he sputtered. "This is my company." "It was your company," I corrected him flawlessly. As of Friday at 4 in the afternoon, Vanguard Holdings acquired a majority controlling interest in Apex Freight. You digitally signed the transition documents yourself. You surrendered the throne. Now step away from my chair. David took a single purposeful step forward, his physical presence looming over my father. Richard looked at the towering legal shark, looked at the 4 armed corporate security guards blocking the exit, and finally looked into my eyes. What he saw there completely broke his resistance. There was no daughter looking back at him. There was only a ruthless corporate owner executing a hostile takeover. Richard swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he released his grip on the leather armrests. He took a clumsy, defeated step to the side, completely surrendering the physical symbol of his power. I smoothly pulled the heavy chair back and took my seat at the head of the boardroom table. I arranged my posture perfectly, claiming the space with effortless dominance. David stepped up beside me and slid the massive 500-page acquisition dossier across the polished wood, positioning it directly in front of me. I unclasped the heavy leather binding and flipped the cover open. The crisp sound of the heavy parchment paper turning echoed sharply in the quiet room. "You mocked me for lacking a degree, Richard." I began, my voice cold and surgical, as I stared at the top page of the executed contract. "You stood on a brightly lit stage in front of 200 people and declared that I had no future because I did not hold a piece of paper from a university you paid for. You based your entire perception of my worth on country club aesthetics and empty titles." I looked up, meeting his terrified gaze. He was breathing heavily, his hands stuffed into his suit pockets to hide their shaking. "But I did not need a piece of paper to build a $500 million equity firm." I continued, delivering the devastating truth with rhythmic precision. "While you were busy playing golf and bragging about a logistics company, you did not actually understand I was teaching myself global finance. I was orchestrating multinational acquisitions. I built Vanguard Holdings in the shadows, structuring it into a financial monolith that could swallow your pathetic little operation by accident." Richard shook his head, his lower lip trembling. "Rachel, please," he rasped, the arrogance completely stripped from his tone. "You do not understand what is happening here. Jamal secured a $20 million buyout. We are profitable. We have assets." I let out a soft, humorless exhale. I reached into the dossier and pulled out the raw, unmanipulated balance sheets my forensic team had compiled. I tossed the thick stack of papers across the table. They fanned out across the mahogany, stopping right in front of where Richard was standing. "I certainly did not need a college degree to realize your company is functionally bankrupt," I stated, driving the final nail into his ego. Richard stared at the documents, his face going ghost white. "Your operational costs have outpaced your revenue for 36 consecutive months," I explained, dismantling his legacy piece by piece. "Your regional logistics contracts are outdated and bleeding cash. Your primary commercial credit lines are entirely maxed out. You do not have assets, Richard. You have a mountain of toxic debt wrapped in a fading corporate logo. The $20 million valuation Jamal pitched to my proxy buyers was a complete fabricated fantasy. Apex Freight is dead in the water." No, Richard whispered, his eyes frantically scanning the highlighted negative numbers on the balance sheets. That cannot be right. Jamal showed me the quarterly projections. We are showing massive growth. We are expanding. You did not read the raw ledgers, I replied coldly. You looked at the pretty, colorful graphs your son-in-law printed out for you, and you patted yourself on the back. You were so addicted to the title of Chief Executive Officer that you completely neglected the actual duties of the job. You drove your own legacy directly into the ground because you were too arrogant to admit you did not know what you were doing. Richard reached out and grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. The immaculate, wealthy patriarch persona he had cultivated for decades shattered completely, leaving behind a broken, clueless old man staring at his own ruin. He looked at me with wide, devastated eyes, finally realizing the absolute magnitude of his failure. The uneducated daughter he had cast out had just returned as the grim reaper of his financial existence. As Richard stood paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his financial ruin, Jamal decided to step into the vacuum. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of being the smartest person in any given room. He simply could not accept that an uneducated college dropout had outmaneuvered him. He smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored suit, cleared his throat, and attempted to reclaim his smooth, authoritative cadence. "Look, let us remain objective here, Rachel," Jamal said, injecting his tone with a patronizing corporate calmness. He stepped away from his chair, gesturing with open hands as if he were explaining a simple concept to a confused intern. "You have a team of expensive lawyers and some very aggressive spreadsheets, but you are fundamentally misunderstanding the macroeconomic headwinds we have been navigating. Apex Freight is a highly leveraged asset, yes, but we are in the middle of a strategic liquidity optimization phase. If we restructure the mezzanine debt and leverage the operational synergies I have mapped out for Q4, the $20 million valuation is completely justified. You are looking at a temporary cash flow bottleneck and calling it bankruptcy." He offered a condescending smile, fully expecting his barrage of advanced finance jargon to intimidate me into silence. He genuinely believed I was just a bitter figurehead who had paid a legal team to do my bidding. He thought he could bury me in Wall Street buzzwords. I let out a slow, perfectly measured breath. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "You are using mezzanine debt as a buzzword to cover up gross insolvency, Jamal," I replied, my voice slicing through his bravado like a scalpel. "You do not have operational synergies. You have a failing supply chain. And your strategic liquidity optimization phase is nothing more than a desperate attempt to dump a rotting carcass onto an anonymous buyer before your commercial creditors force you into involuntary liquidation." Jamal flinched, his patronizing smile slipping, as I flawlessly dismantled his corporate word salad. He opened his mouth to counter, but I did not give him the oxygen. "But we are not here to debate your incompetence as a vice president of finance." I continued, my tone shifting from cold corporate critique to lethal criminal accusation. "We are here to discuss your extracurricular activities." "David, illuminate the screen." David tapped a command into his secure tablet. At the far end of the boardroom, the heavy oak paneling slid apart, revealing a massive state-of-the-art digital projection screen. A high-resolution projector hummed to life from the ceiling, casting a blindingly crisp financial schematic across the wall. The entire room was bathed in the harsh, undeniable light of Jamal's secret ledger. "Let us talk about liquidity optimization, Jamal," I said, stepping away from the head of the table and walking slowly toward the glowing screen. "Specifically, let us talk about how you optimized my father's remaining liquid capital right into your own pockets." The screen displayed a complex, highly detailed flowchart. At the top was the Apex Freight primary commercial operating account. Below it were 4 distinct branching lines, each leading to a different corporate entity. "Do these names look familiar to you?" I asked, tapping the screen right below the bolded headings. "Southern Transit Partners, Horizon Freight Lines, Atlantic Cargo Logistics, Peach State Hauling." Jamal froze. The remaining blood drained entirely from his face. His confident alpha male posture collapsed in an instant, his shoulders slumping, as if a physical weight had just been dropped onto his spine. He recognized the names perfectly. Over the past 36 months, Apex Freight has paid out massive recurring disbursements to these four logistics subcontractors, I explained, projecting my voice so every single person in the room heard the irrefutable truth. To my father, they looked like standard accounts payable for regional hauling routes. But my forensic accountants dug a little deeper. We pulled the operational manifests. We checked the Department of Transportation compliance logs. And we discovered an absolute void. These trucks do not exist. These drivers do not exist. These are ghost vendors, Jamal. Empty shell companies registered to anonymous post office boxes in Delaware. Richard turned his head slowly, his devastated eyes locking onto Jamal. What is she talking about? Richard rasped, his voice trembling with a terrifying new realization. Jamal, what are these companies? Jamal could not speak. His mouth opened and closed silently, his eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. My armed corporate security guards shifted their weight by the doors, a silent reminder that he was entirely trapped. I will tell you exactly what they are. Richard, I answered for him. They are the mechanism of your destruction. Jamal has been generating fraudulent invoices for trucking routes that were never actually driven. He approved those fake invoices himself, paid them directly out of your failing company's remaining cash reserves, and routed the funds through those Delaware shell companies. I gestured to David, who tapped his tablet again. The flowchart on the screen shifted, tracing the money from the four ghost vendors down into a single centralized offshore holding account. The name on the private wealth management signature card appeared in massive bold letters across the projection. Jamal. Let us talk about the $4.2 million you funneled into those shell companies. Jamal, I stated, dropping the exact staggering numerical value like a live grenade onto the center of the mahogany table. $4.2 million stolen directly from a company that was already struggling to make payroll. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, heavy with the weight of a federal felony. That is the same money that bought that custom black Porsche you proudly displayed in the valet lane at the country club. I continued, taking a step toward him, forcing him to look me in the eye. That is the same stolen money you used to buy your wife's $30,000 diamond tennis bracelet. And that is the exact same stolen money you used to pull a $50 bill from your designer wallet to throw at my feet, telling me to leave the corporate world to the educated adults. Jamal physically recoiled, stumbling backward until the back of his knees hit his leather executive chair. He collapsed into the seat, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkling around him. His hands were shaking violently. The slick, arrogant executive who had mocked my lack of a college degree was gone. In his place sat a terrified criminal staring down the barrel of a multi-year federal prison sentence. A sharp, hysterical gasp shattered the quiet room. Vanessa was standing up, her hands clutching the edge of the table. She looked from the damning flowchart on the glowing screen to the trembling, broken man sitting next to her. Her eyes were wide with absolute, unadulterated horror. She was incredibly spoiled, and she was fundamentally ignorant of corporate finance. But even she understood the words $4.2 million in offshore holding account. The reality hit her with the force of a freight train. Her upcoming trip to the Maldives, her massive suburban mansion, her entire elite country club lifestyle, it was all a mirage built on her husband's federal crimes. And worse, he had stolen that money directly from her own father, deliberately driving their family legacy into the ground just to keep her draped in diamonds. Jamal, Vanessa whispered, her voice cracking, tears of sheer panic welling in her eyes. Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not steal from my father. Jamal could not even look at his wife. He stared blankly at the polished mahogany table, his chest heaving as he realized that the uneducated dropout he had dismissed as worthless had just meticulously, flawlessly, and legally destroyed his entire life. Jamal's silence hung in the room, heavier than any spoken confession. He could not look at his wife. He kept his eyes fixed on the polished wood of the table, his breath shuddering through his chest. Vanessa let out a shrill, piercing wail, her manicured hands tearing at her perfectly styled hair. The illusion of her elite existence was shattering into a million jagged pieces right in front of her eyes. The sound of his golden daughter weeping seemed to snap Richard out of his paralyzed state. The sickly ashen gray color of his face rapidly transformed into a violent mottled purple. The veins in his neck bulged against the stiff collar of his dress shirt. He turned toward Jamal, his hands balling into tight, shaking fists. "You stole from me!" Richard roared, the sheer volume of his voice vibrating the crystal water pitchers on the boardroom table. "You absolute parasite! I brought you into my company. I gave you a vice president title. I stood on a stage 2 days ago and told the entire world you were a financial genius and you were robbing me blind the entire time." Richard lunged forward, grabbing Jamal by the lapels of his custom-tailored suit. He hauled the younger man half out of his chair, spit flying from his lips as he screamed directly into Jamal's face. "I trusted you. You took millions of dollars from my legacy to buy sports cars while I was begging the bank for extensions. I will tear you apart with my bare hands." The two corporate security guards stationed by the door stepped forward, their hands dropping to their utility belts, but I raised a single finger to halt them. I did not want them to intervene. I wanted to watch the syndicate implode. Jamal violently shoved Richard backward, breaking the older man's grip. The terror in Jamal's eyes instantly morphed into a defensive, cornered rage. The smooth, respectful son-in-law persona completely evaporated, replaced by the vicious opportunist he truly was. "Do not you dare play the victim, Richard!" Jamal screamed back, his voice echoing off the oak panels. "You are a dinosaur. Your business model was dead 5 years ago. You were hemorrhaging cash long before I ever got access to the treasury. You did not know how to negotiate a modern supply chain contract, and you did not even know how to open a basic spreadsheet." Jamal pointed a shaking finger at Richard, his chest heaving. "I kept this pathetic company alive on paper. I generated the fake projections that kept the commercial creditors from foreclosing on your house 2 years ago. Yes, I took my cut. I took what I deserved for carrying your dead weight. You were just too stupid and outdated to notice the money was gone." Richard stumbled back as if he had been physically struck, gasping for air. Before he could respond, Vanessa threw herself into the center of the chaos. "You ruined my life!" Vanessa shrieked at Jamal, tears streaming down her face, completely destroying her expensive makeup. She started hitting Jamal in the chest with her fists, completely unhinged. "What about the country club? What about my friends? My entire life is built on that money. You promised me we were rich. You promised me the Maldives. You are going to federal prison and they are going to take everything from me." Jamal grabbed her wrists, roughly pushing her away. "Grow up, Vanessa," he snapped cruelly. "You spent that stolen money faster than I could launder it. You loved the diamonds and the cars, and you never once asked how a regional logistics manager could afford them. You are just as guilty as I am." The perfect elite golden family was tearing itself apart in a frenzy of greed, blame, and sheer panic. They were feral animals fighting over the scraps of a rotting carcass. I stood at the head of the table, my hands resting calmly on the leather binder, watching the spectacle with absolute clinical detachment. For 33 years, they had presented a united front of flawless superiority, completely bonded by their shared disdain for me. But loyalty bought with stolen money is no loyalty at all. The absolute second the funding dried up, they devoured each other. The screaming match reached a fever pitch. Richard was threatening to call the police on his own son-in-law. Jamal was shouting that he would testify against Richard for corporate negligence. Vanessa was sobbing hysterically, sinking to her knees on the imported wool carpet. I had seen enough. I lifted my right hand and brought my palm down flat against the solid mahogany table. The sharp, violent crack of my hand against the wood severed the chaos like a blade. The screaming stopped instantly. Richard, Jamal, and Vanessa froze, their heads snapping toward me. The heavy silence rushed back into the room, leaving them panting and staring at the uneducated dropout who was currently dictating their reality. "You are all entirely missing the point," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that demanded absolute attention. "You are fighting over a $20 million buyout that no longer exists." Richard blinked, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "What do you mean it no longer exists?" "We signed the term sheets. You have to honor the acquisition. You cannot just cancel a corporate buyout." "I can, and I just did," I replied smoothly. Vanguard Holdings does not pay a $20 million premium for a highly leveraged crime scene. Due to the massive liabilities Jamal created, the offshore embezzlement, and the catastrophic operational debt you completely failed to manage, the valuation of Apex Freight has been aggressively adjusted. I looked over at David. He pulled a single crisp sheet of paper from his briefcase and slid it down the table. It came to a stop directly in front of Richard. "There is no cash payout," I stated, staring directly into my father's terrified eyes. "Vanguard Holdings is acquiring Apex Freight for exactly $1 plus the assumption of your toxic commercial debt. $1. The words hung in the air, a final crushing verdict. I was not just taking their company. I was stripping them of every single cent they thought they were getting, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and the catastrophic consequences of their own arrogance. I was not just taking their company. I was stripping them of every single cent they thought they were getting, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and the catastrophic consequences of their own arrogance." Richard stared down at the crisp white sheet of paper resting on the mahogany table, his eyes locked onto the bold black ink displaying the purchase price of $1. The concept completely broke his mind. He had walked into this room expecting to be crowned a $20 million victor. He had planned to spend his afternoon browsing luxury real estate listings for a retirement home in Florida. Instead, he was looking at the absolute undeniable evaporation of his entire net worth. He snapped his head up, his face contorting into a mask of desperate, furious denial. He slammed his fist onto the table. "You cannot do this!" Richard spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "You do not have the power to just alter the terms of a corporate buyout because you are holding a grudge. I will simply tear this paper up. I am walking away from the table. I am still the chief executive officer of this company, and I am officially canceling this acquisition. We will find another buyer." He reached out to grab the paper, fully intending to rip it to shreds, but David was faster. The seasoned legal shark smoothly slid the document out of Richard's reach, slipping it back into the massive leather dossier. "You do not seem to grasp the mechanics of modern corporate law, Richard." David stated, his deep voice carrying a tone of almost pitying condescension. "You cannot walk away from the table. You are already permanently bolted to it." Richard puffed out his chest, trying to project authority he no longer possessed. "The deal is not finalized until the physical closing meeting concludes and the physical ink dries on the master contracts. I have not signed anything today." "The ink dried on Friday night, Richard," Voigt interjected, stepping perfectly into his line of sight to ensure he absorbed every single syllable. "You did not just sign preliminary term sheets. In your absolute blinding greed to secure the cash payout before your commercial creditors realized you were insolvent, you and Jamal authorized the binding digital transition documents. You executed the electronic signatures at exactly 4 in the afternoon." Jamal's head snapped up. His eyes widened as the lethal reality of his own aggressive negotiation tactics finally caught up to him. He had pushed the Vanguard proxy buyers for an expedited, fully binding digital close to ensure the money would be locked in before the weekend. He had unknowingly built the exact case